All right, guys, so let's get to the final causes of the French Revolution. How does this revolution officially begin? So we've been talking about in the previous couple lectures the long-term causes, some of the shorter-term causes during the time of Louis the 16th, the economy, the perception again of how out of touch they were, where they're living under one set of rules while everybody else is living under another set of rules, and how what they say, don't do this, and then they go and do this, that kind of stuff. And that often comes back to bite politicians in the butt quite frequently. And so in this case, all of these things are piling up until we get to 1789. And when we finally get to 1789, the rear of the revolution begins. Everything's really going to explode. Also, for those of you taking my class here, you have in your module a kind of a review chart, a timeline that helps you walk yourself through all of this. So definitely use that to help you as well as you're preparing and you're reviewing for all this. So you do have that timeline there in your module. All right, so here we go. The States General. Let's talk about these guys and what role they play in leading up to the French Revolution. So the States General, that's essentially the parliament in France. And they had not met for a very long time, right? During the whole period of absolutism, they didn't get a chance to meet. And there are three. So let me break this down to you to explain it and give you some details on this, because you do need to understand this. And this is where things get a little complicated, actually, because when you talk about where the French Revolution begins, I think you can make an argument that it begins more within the Estates General than it does between the people and the king. But the king, of course, is going to be very much involved. So the States General, again, is this parliament in France. There are three estates, what we call the church, the nobility, and the commoners. And what I have here are their percentages, right, of the population they represent. So the church represents about 6% of the population, the nobility about 4%, the commoners about 90% of the population. Now you want to get a few other things down here as you talk about the Estates General. Remember, as you take notes, it's not enough just to write the words. Everything I say about the words really matters as well. There were 1,200 members who were in this States General. 1,200, okay? And you'll see why I'm talking about this. 300 came from the church, 300 came from the nobility, and 600 came from the commoners. Now, initially, you'd say, well, the commoners get the most number of people, but per capita, they're not, right? Because yes, there's 300 from this group and 300 from the other group. The issue, of course, is there's a lot more commoners. Now, within the commoners, this is something else I want you to know. So there's 300, 300, and 600. Within the commoners, I think there's another division you need to be aware of. When I say commoners, that's pretty much everybody else in France. And that could include everywhere from a peasant to a wealthy merchant, but they're not a noble. And so when you break that up, very often is almost like a 70-20% split here too that I think you can talk about, where maybe about 20% of these commoners were these merchants, a little wealthier, and the other 70% are your lower classes peasants. So keep that in mind as well. And so when the Estates General is meeting, and they meet in 1789, the commoners that are being represented, the 600 people are representing the commoners, they're not peasants, right? They're going to be this merchants group mainly. So you've got 300 members from the church, 300 members from the nobility, and 600 members from the commoners, but they're pretty much all these kind of merchant class lawyers, those kind of individuals. They start meeting. And it doesn't take long for a lot of arguments to begin within these third estates. Specifically, what we're going to see happening is the first two estates, the church and the nobility, they don't want to rock the boat too much. They're excuse me, they're relatively happy. Things are going well. It's this commoners, this third estate, and these merchants specifically are like, wait, we need some dramatic changes. What dramatic changes do they want in France? Well, they want a lot of the ideas that we saw in the Enlightenment, right? They want more rights and more privileges and more checks and balance of power. What's interesting is, what about this other 70%? What does that group want? Well, that 70%, guess what they want? They want food, right? They're hungry. They want, that's their number one concern, I think it's fair to say at this point. And so there's a lot of arguing and there's a lot of back and forth in May of 1789. And here I am going month by month. And I always tell students you don't need to memorize dates, but you do need to get the chronology correctly. And that's why, again, in your module, you have that timeline, kind of this chart that's kind of a timeline to help you out with all this. So we get through May, we get into June, and the argument is continuing until finally the third estate, the commoners say, you know what, we've had enough, and this is what's going to happen. Oh, let me show you one other image first. And this next image, and I'll show you what's going to happen with the commoners, really captures what I'm talking about, the conflict between the estates. So look at this kind of cartoon here, right? And basically what you're seeing is an image of the mentality of people during this time period where you have, the commoner down here in chains, right? And then you have the king, you have the nobility, you have the church, and they're basically riding the back of the commoners. One of the interesting differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution is the American Revolution is very much centered on the concept of liberty, about freedom. The French Revolution is much more about egalitarianism, and it's not the same thing, right? Equality and liberty are very different. I explain this in more detail in my classes, but when you think about it, sometimes equality and liberty butt heads. I mean, the more equality you try to force on a society, the less liberty that society has. And it has to do with the idea that we're not all equal in the sense of, some people work harder, some don't, some are smarter, some are bigger, some are smaller, some are more ambitious, some are lazy. And so human nature keeps us all from being naturally equal. Can we create a society where everyone's equal? Yeah, you can, but it usually involves a lot less freedom. So it's a very interesting little side note there that I do like mentioning. But this cartoon really captures the feeling of this third estate. So what are the members of the third estate going to do? Well, this is what they're going to do. In June of 1789, they're going to break away. And they're going to create their own assembly called the National Assembly. Now, when they initially do this, funny little story, the first two estates say, you can't do this. And the third estate says, well, what are you going to do about it? And, the first two estates say basically, well, we're not going to let you meet. We're going to lock the doors so you can't meet. So what do? They go to a nearby tennis court, indoor tennis court, and there in June of 1789, they take what is called the tennis court oath. This famous image of it. And they basically promise, these members of the third estate, right, mainly merchants and such, are promising to stick together until they come up with a document that reflects the ideas of the revolution. Of the Enlightenment, reflects the ideas of the Enlightenment. So now the question is, what's going to happen with this? Where is this all going to go? And now something's going to have to be decided with Louis. Now Louis XVI has to make a choice. What is Louis XVI going to do? Is he going to side with the first two estates, or is he going to side with the National Assembly? Because he theoretically can side with the National Assembly and say, hey guys, you have some good points, let's change some things. Or is he going to, hold strong and say, no, I'm going to just stick with what I'm doing. I don't want to change. And so that's the decision. And then we get to July of 1789. And in July of 1789, late June, early July, remember that guy Necker from the last lecture that I mentioned? Louis dismisses him. And when Louis dismissed Necker, that resonated because, and again, it's that small little story, N-E-C-K-E-R, I don't have it up there right now, but if you remember from the last lecture, because he was the one guy in the Louis' ears that was kind of more for this third estate group. And when he was dismissed, fired, basically that tells everybody we know what Louis is going to do. He's going to side with the third estate. With the first two estates. And so then everything is about to explode in July, the official beginning, July 14, 1789, Bastille Day. And what is this? Well, this was the moment where a number of uprisings and riots began. And Bastille itself wasn't, Bastille is a prison armory place. It wasn't like there was a million prisoners there and a huge amount of ammunition. It's more symbolic in many ways, I think. But it was when a lot of people just started to uprise and revolt inside of France. And with that, in July 14, 1789, Louis makes the decision to side with the two estates. And this is the thing. At one point, Louis was probably going to try to stop this National Assembly. But then it's very hard for Louis to stop the National Assembly because all of a sudden he's got these riots going on all over the place. And I think it's also worth remembering that a lot of the people who are rioting and uprising don't even want the same thing as the people in the National Assembly. Some do, some don't. Again, for some of them, it's about the ideas of the Enlightenment. For other people, it's simply about food. And now you've got the church and the nobles and the king, and now it's one big mess. And so that's essentially how the French Revolution begins. And so now we can move on in our next lecture and talk about the actual events during the first phase of the French Revolution and where that all goes from there. All right, hope all that was clear. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.